we are back for episode 5.2. Our episode begins with Arya on her way to Braavos. In a scene from the book, Arya is somewhat startled by the Titan of Braavos and is told not to be afraid. Now in the book, the captain of the ship is too busy, and so the captain's son sometimes keeps Arya company. For the most part though, no one speaks to Arya, and she finds the trip quite lonely. The crew seem to know the common tongue back in Westeros, but once at sea, no one is really able to speak to Arya save the captain and his son. On top of this, some of the crew shuns Arya and doesn't interact with her at all. That said, others in the crew, including the captain and his son, are very insistent that Arya learn their names. This may be because faceless men are not allowed to kill people they know. Now here Braavos is quite sunny, but in the book Braavos is said to be always cold, foggy, and rainy. This fog allowed the city to hide from the Valyrians and their dragons back in the day, but more importantly, this crappy weather has created one of the biggest and most contentious points of debate among fans. You see, Daenerys supposedly grew up in Braavos, but she remembers green fields and a lemon tree outside her window. Braavos, with its canals, salt spray, and cold and rainy climate, is pretty darn far from Dany's memories. There are about a dozen inconsistencies between Dany's memory and the city of Braavos, but the most obvious one is that our author has included a conversation with two men, flat out saying that citrus doesn't grow in Braavos. So what is up with that lemon tree? If Dany didn't grow up in Braavos, this means she has been lied to about her past by Viserys for some reason, and what her true past is an enormous mystery. So here Arya makes it to the House of the Undying. It should be noted that in the books, the doors on the House of the Undying are weirwood and ebony, and Arya specifically is reminded of the Godswood at Winterfell. Weirwood and ebony doors are also found on the House of the Undying in Qarth, so we seem to have a parallel with weirwoods, the House of the Undying, and the House of Black and White. They all seem to be places that consume or absorb people. So here an unfriendly looking priest opens the door, but in the book the head of the House of Black and White is a kindly looking man. So much so that Arya only refers to him as the kindly man. Now here in the show, Arya is turned away to test her perseverance, something that doesn't happen in the book. Next we have some extra scenes that bear no similarity to the book story whatsoever. Brienne and Pod sit in an inn and happen to run into Sansa. Brienne then asks Sansa if she needs help, and she says no, and then Brienne runs from Littlefinger's men before murdering them all. Currently in the book, Brienne and Sansa are nowhere near each other. Next we get an extra scene where Cersei has received a threatening box from Dorne with Myrcella's necklace inside it. She reassembles the box so Jaime can get the full effect of it, and then Jaime decides he needs to go to Dorne to rescue his daughter. So in the book, Cersei does send a Kingsguard named Balon Swan to Dorne to deliver the mountain's head. Cersei has assigned Balon with another task, and there's some debate on what that task is exactly. When Balon arrives in Dorne, he says he's there to escort Myrcella back to King's Landing for only a short visit. This seems like a feeble plan to simply get Myrcella back home and to have her never return to Dorne. Doran Martell, though, later claims that the task is more sinister, and it's to also murder his son Trystane. That said, Doran's stories can hardly be trusted, and Balon Swan is a fairly honorable knight, so that might just be a lie. Whatever the full motivation, Cersei did seem to want to get her daughter back. And this brings us to an extra scene with Bronn and his betrothed, Lollys Stokeworth. Now earlier in the show, Lollys was said to be mentally challenged, as she is in the book. The show seems to have retconned this in order to make her normal. Still, as in the book, Lollys is the younger daughter and is not due to inherit anything. Her older sister Felice is to inherit Castle Stokeworth, and here in the show, Bronn hints that something bad is bound to happen to Felice. Now in the book, this is exactly what happens, though much of it is Cersei's doing. You see, in the book, Lollys was raped at the riot of King's Landing and gets pregnant and births a son that Bronn names Tyrion. Cersei believes that Bronn is still in league with Tyrion, and so she asks Felice's husband to deal with Bronn. He challenges Bronn to a duel and is promptly killed. Cersei then gives Felice to Qyburn for his experiments, where she dies. And thus in the end, Bronn and Lollys do end up with Stokeworth. Now here in the show, we veer away from that plot completely as Jaime Lannister arrives and calls off Bronn's marriage to Lollys. Bronn is to accompany Jaime to Dorne, and in exchange he'll receive an even better betrothal. Which brings us to our new location of Dorne. Now here in the show, Ellaria Sand is the center of most of the action in Dorne. In the book, the main character more or less is Doran's daughter Arianna Martell, although other characters including Arya Hota and a Kingsguard named Aerys Oakheart do have perspectives. In the book, Ellaria Sand is a rather minor character who appears to have the opposite personality of show Ellaria. She wants peace and wants to break the cycle of violence. Anyway, this particular scene seems to mirror the first Dornish chapter in the 4th book, A Feast for Crows. Here Ellaria is upset about the death of Oberyn and wants Oberyn's brother Doran Martell to seek revenge. In the book, it's the 3 sand snakes, Obara, Lady Nym, and Tyene, who each visit Doran in kind. Obara wants to attack Oldtown, Lady Nym wants to murder Jaime, Cersei, Tywin, and Tommen, and Tyene wants to crown Myrcella queen because Myrcella is a year older than Tommen. Doran then has the 3 sand snakes arrested. Now I said there are 3 sand snakes, but in the book there's actually 4 sand snakes. Well, in truth there are 8 sand snakes, but only the first 4 have had very large roles. The 4th sand snake is Sorella Sand, and she's posing as a man and studying at the Citadel. Now here we find that Myrcella and Trystane very much like each other. In the book, Myrcella and Trystane do have an affinity for each other, but we aren't quite sure if Myrcella is Myrcella. You see, Myrcella has a body double named Rosamund, and so it's possible that Trystane and Rosamund are the ones who fancy each other. Meanwhile, over in Slaver's Bay, we have an extra scene with Daario and Grey Worm searching for the Sons of the Harpy. They search a house and find one hiding behind a wall. Now in the book, Grey Worm does report on the security of the city, but later on this job falls more and more to another advisor that Dany has called Skahaz. As I mentioned last time, Skahaz is the leader of the Shave Pates, who are Meereenese noblemen who have now become revolutionaries. Skahaz convinces Dany to allow him to form his own security band called the Brazen Beasts. In one of Dany's dumber decisions, she allows the Brazen Beasts to torture captured criminals, yielding fairly useless information. At one point, Dany even allows the torture of innocent daughters while a likely innocent father watches on. Now here in the show, Dany has a council of advisors to give her different perspectives, and Daario tells us that, as in the book, prisoners are being tortured. Now on this council is also the angry Mosidor, who wants the prisoner executed. Last time I somewhat mistakenly said that Mosidor was a show-only character. In the book there is in fact a Mosidor, but he has little in common with the show Mosidor. In the book he's an Unsullied who is the brother of Missandei, and he's murdered while patrolling. Now Dany does have quite a few advisors in the book as well. The problem is, none of them are very good except for maybe Reznak, who Dany doesn't trust very much. The real problem is that most of her advisors have a military background, and all of them keep trying to push her into more conflicts. Now here in the show, Barristan is the wisest and most progressive of Dany's advisors, and he encourages her to be a kind and just ruler, unlike her father. Here he tries to convince Dany to give the captured Harpy a fair trial, even though those things don't even exist in Westeros. Now in the book, Barristan doesn't give any of this sage advice. In fact, he's quite different from his show counterpart. Yes, both Barristans are brave, honest, and trustworthy, but Book Barristan is also specifically said to be not a very smart man. He is old, stubborn, and doesn't understand or respect anything about Meereen. One comic example of this in the book is that Barristan refuses to use the title Your Magnificence instead of Your Grace, even though a Grace in Meereen is a priestess and a sometimes sex worker. When it comes down to it, Barristan knows war and fighting and not much else. He simply wants Dany to abandon Meereen and head to Westeros. Next we catch up with Tyrion on his trip to Volantis. Now here in the show, he and Varys discuss Dany some more, and Varys weirdly compliments Tyrion on his ability to rule. And then they talk about how it's not safe for Tyrion out there because Cersei is trying to kill him. Now I have to say, in the book, Varys would likely not think Tyrion a very good ruler when he was Hand. Varys spent the entire second book manipulating Tyrion when he was Hand to create division between Tyrion and Cersei. Whatever the case, Tyrion's trip to Volantis is completely different in the book. First of all, it happens not by wagon, but by riverboat. Essentially, Illyrio drops Tyrion off at the river with a man named Griff, his son, young Griff, and a bunch of other companions, including a maester and a septa. The group heads downriver, and Tyrion observes young Griff getting trained in fighting, languages, and history. Eventually, Tyrion guesses who young Griff really is. Young Griff is Aegon Targaryen, the son of Rhaegar, while Griff is Jon Connington, Rhaegar's exiled friend and former Hand of the King. Varys and Illyrio have been hiding and grooming Aegon for rule his entire life. And this is perhaps the largest irreconcilable difference between the book and the show. Varys and Illyrio support a different Targaryen cause completely in the book. And many fans speculate that it's secretly not even a Targaryen cause, but a Blackfyre cause. House Blackfyre was founded by a legitimized Targaryen bastard and fought several wars against the Targaryens. Next we head to King's Landing with Cersei and Qyburn. As in the book, Cersei is presented with the wrong head of a dwarf, but shows clemency on the men because she doesn't want to dissuade others from hunting Tyrion. Now interestingly, here in the show, Qyburn asks for the head for research. Now in the book, we never see Qyburn get a hold of a dwarf head. That said, Qyburn does send a large skull to Dorne that is supposed to be the mountain's head, but is almost certainly not. It may be that Qyburn used Cersei's dwarf head as a substitution, as dwarf heads are actually larger than the average human head. In our next scene, we meet Tommen's small council. Here we have Mace Tyrell, who is acting as Master of Ships, and is later given the position Master of Coin as well. We of course have Grand Maester Pycelle, and Kevin Lannister is here for some reason, and Cersei attempts to make him Master of War, though he refuses. Cersei then announces that Qyburn will be her Master of Whispers. Now in the book, Cersei's small council is a bit different. She fears Tyrell power mainly, and thus makes her choices accordingly. Qyburn and Pycelle are the same, but her Master of Ships is a man named Arayn Waters, a former Stannis supporter who Cersei thinks she can control with her looks. Her Master of Law is Orton Merryweather, who is the husband of a woman named Taena, who has been manipulating Cersei. Cersei likes Taena because she testified against Tyrion, and she's a bit of a suck-up. The old, sickly, and loyal Giles Rosby is her Master of Coin, and her hand is the loyal but stupid Harry Swift. Now this chapter where Cersei holds a small council meeting is one of the most important chapters in the entire series, in that Cersei ends up majorly affecting a dozen different plot lines, ranging from King's Landing to the North, to the Wall, to Braavos, to Dorne, to the Vale. Most notably, Cersei's actions lead to Littlefinger gaining power, the Iron Bank supporting Stannis, and Jon Snow getting stabbed. Next we get an extra scene with Shireen teaching Gilly how to read. Now in the book, it's doubtful Shireen and Gilly ever met, as Sam and Gilly only briefly passed through Eastwatch by the Sea when Shireen was there. Here the two discuss grayscale, and Show Gilly says that two of her sisters had the disease. Craster ended up quarantining the women. In the book, the wildlings kill people with grayscale. Val, the supposed wildling princess, actually meets Shireen and suggests to Jon that he should murder her. And then we get an extra scene with Selyse telling Shireen to stay away from wildlings because Stannis executed their king and Gilly is dangerous. Now in the book, Selyse does seem to have a problem with wildlings, but it's mainly because they're an unruly and rude lot. She does not seem to fear them though. Next we have a scene where Jon tells Stannis that the wildlings will never follow him because he's an outsider. Stannis then shows Jon a letter from Lyanna Mormont of Bear Island, who says she will only follow a Stark. Stannis then offers Jon legitimization and lordship of Winterfell, noting that life under Alliser Thorne as Lord Commander will not be great. Now this is sort of a combination of a bunch of different scenes from the book. First of all, Stannis comes to the Wall specifically because he wants to control the wildlings, a feat that Jon never claims is impossible as an outsider. After all, Mance himself was not a wildling originally. Still, in the book, Stannis definitely recognizes that he's an outsider and tries to gain control of the wildlings through wildling intermediaries. Stannis aligns himself with Mance's lieutenants, Val, and Mance himself, who is spared in the book. Now, Lyanna's letter is a bit peculiar. You see, in the book, Lyanna Mormont is not the Lady of Bear Island, nor is she the heir, nor is she the Castellan, or anyone important. She's a 10-year-old girl who is at least 6th in line. Why she is responding to Stannis is a bit baffling, but regardless, her words are meaningless as she holds no power. Now in the book, Stannis does offer Jon legitimization and lordship as well as the haughty Val. The alternative for Jon is probably death if Janos Slynt wins. The only real downside for Jon is the breaking of his vows, and thus the rejection of the old gods. This isn't to say that Stannis is requiring Jon to convert to the religion of R'hllor, but Jon thinks the breaking of his vows is a religious decision. Jon is actually ready to accept Stannis' deal, as he always wanted Winterfell and children, and feels he could protect Mance and Gilly's children by raising them at Winterfell. But then suddenly Ghost returns. At this point, Jon suddenly changes his mind and decides the old gods are important. And this calls into question whether Ghost's return was coincidental, or if he was sent back intentionally by someone. Now, quite significantly, in both book and show, Jon makes his decision to stay with the Night's Watch before being nominated in the election for Lord Commander. though in the show, his decision to keep his vow is divorced from religion. Which brings us to the Night's Watch's election of its Lord Commander. Now here in the show, the election is at first between Alliser Thorne and Denys Mallister. After some speeches from Janos Slynt and some random, Sam jumps in and nominates Jon Snow and gives a moving speech as well. Alliser Thorne then gives an anti-Jon speech. The election is close, but Jon wins a narrow plurality because of Maester Aemon's tie-breaking vote. Now in the book, the election is pretty darn different and spans several chapters. So to win, a candidate needs a 2/3 supermajority. And because there are so many candidates in this election, no one has gotten close after 10 rounds of voting. Janos Slynt, though, has been gaining every round while the other candidates have been falling. After a few more rounds, Slynt will likely win. But here's the thing, the election has a number of weaknesses to exploit. Votes can be cast by proxy, and it's all counted in the end by Sam, a half-blind steward, and a fully blind Aemon. And most egregiously, the commanders of the Shadow Tower and Eastwatch by the Sea get to vote for their entire garrisons. That's over 100 votes each, out of 589 votes. These two commanders, Denys Mallister and Cotter Pike, both happen to be running, and both happen to hate each other. And so in the book, Sam decides to manipulate the election. He lies to Pike and Mallister and says that Stannis is going to install the other if consensus isn't reached, so they better vote for Jon Snow. Still, even after that, Jon likely wouldn't have gotten 2/3 of the vote. But then another candidate drops out who was going to support Slynt, but then weirdly forgets why he liked Slynt. He, out of the blue, somewhat endorses Jon Snow. And on top of this, then Mormont's pet raven flies out of a kettle and screams Jon Snow's name. We aren't sure how this raven got in the kettle, but it's almost certain that this raven is being skin changed. What's funny is that none of Jon's acts of bravery or leadership are ever mentioned. His squireship with Mormont is mentioned, as is his relationship to Uncle Benjen. It's manipulation, not valor, that makes Jon Snow win in a landslide. Next we get an extra scene with Arya killing a pigeon and then some street thugs trying to take her sword. The old man from the House of Black and White scares away the thugs, and then Arya follows him home, and he reveals himself to be Jaqen H'ghar. So nothing like this happens in the book, but I will say there are men in Braavos who will challenge someone to a duel if they happen to be wearing a sword. Sam is nearly killed by one of them when he comes to Braavos. Now in the book, Arya has a different act of courage that gets her admitted into the House of Black and White. The kindly man changes his face to be a skull with a worm coming out of his eye, a little parallel to Bloodraven, who has a root coming out of his eye. Arya then grabs the worm and eats it. Now the show uses Jaqen H'ghar as Arya's guide at the House of Black and White. Again, her guide in the book is the kindly man, but Jaqen H'ghar does have other adventures. At the beginning of Book 4, we find Jaqen in Old Town, where he bribes an acolyte of the Citadel for a key that opens all of the doors there. Jaqen then assumes this acolyte's identity. What exactly Jaqen is up to is a mystery. So over in Slaver's Bay, we next get a whole bunch of extra story where Mosidor sneaks down to talk to the captured Harpy. He kills the Harpy, and then Dany sentences Mosidor to death. Mosidor is publicly executed, and then a riot breaks out. Nothing similar to this happens in the book. Dany has no trials, no public execution of freedmen, or riots while ruling. And in our final scene of the episode, Dany goes out to her balcony to be visited by Drogon. Now in the book, Dany is never visited by Drogon and Meereen until his appearance at the fighting pits. That said, there is a scene in the book where Dany goes out to her balcony at night to find Quaithe, the mysterious masked woman from Qarth. Quaithe tells Dany the glass candles are burning, soon comes the Pale Mare, and after her the others, Kraken and Darkflame, Lion and Griffin, the Sun's Son, and the Mummer's Dragon. Trust none of them, remember the Undying, beware the perfumed Seneschal. Fans have debated the meaning of this quite a bit, but perhaps the most important aspect of it is that it makes Dany mistrustful of everyone and paranoid. After all, Dany herself has no idea what it means. And that's all for episode 5.2. See you in episode 5.3.